Hi everybody and welcome to MMF's second Conflict Cafe. This session is going to focus on building better relationships with colleagues. My name is Oscar Mathew. I'm one of the directors of MMF. Nice to be with you all virtually. So in the course of this short webinar, we're going to cover the following topics: our relationship with conflict, conflict escalation in healthcare, how we see it tending to escalate, and how you might want to try and manage and prevent conflict escalation where it happens. And the first thing to focus on here, I think, is that we're having this conversation at a very particular time. The pandemic may be over, looks like it might be over, but much of what the future holds is still pretty uncertain. When the pandemic started, the nature of people's relationships with their colleagues changed slightly, or at least it appeared to me to change slightly when I was working with groups. And people kind of banded together, and lots of the existing fracture lines or tensions kind of seemed to disappear overnight, only later to reappear once the pandemic faded away. So I think it's worth kind of taking a moment to think about where we are in the history of the pandemic and what that's done to our relationship with colleagues. So one of the fundamental kind of truisms, I suppose, of conflict is laid out in this quote from Maya Angelou, who's the now dead American poet. And she said that I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget the way you made them feel. And that's a very resonant quote for us in this area. One of the things that Harvard brought out of their research on conflict is that if we're going to get anywhere with conflict, we need to kind of move away from this idea that conflict is about being on the side of justice and the kind of I'm right and you're wrong. Because although you can be technically right and you can be on the side of justice, if you're going to try and move beyond conflict, you're not going to get anywhere if you're just stuck in a wrestling match where you're saying I'm right and you're wrong. Most conflict is about a complex interplay between histories, perspectives, value judgments, and taking a step back and moving away from this idea of being right is the first thing we need to do when we are going to move into a kind of more constructive space and resolve conflict. Because the reason that we don't get anywhere when we're in conflict is that we think we have it right and that they're the problem. They think that they're right and we're the problem, although it's very difficult for you to see that when you're in conflict. And that the main issue is that neither person's conclusion when looking at the landscape in front of you makes sense to each other. And this is something, there's one of the kind of core concepts, I suppose, that Harvard bring out in their work, is that we make assumptions about people's intent based upon its impact on us. And what we're aware of as we go about the world as humans are our own intentions and other people's impact on us. But we can't see other people's intentions or our impact on them. And when relationships break down, we tend to, and I see this a lot in my work, mediating between colleagues in a healthcare context, is that what we do is we project into that right-hand column what we fear or suspect might be there, but not what we know is there. So when I mediate, I'll often go and see someone who will appear very reasonable and paint the other person that they're in conflict with in a very negative light and say that they're lying and they're causing them pain and they don't care. And then I'll go and see the other person and they'll repeat pretty much the same message back to me. And this is what's going on most of the time. So as mediators, what we want to try and do is look below the surface. The positions and behaviors above the surface there in this iceberg are what people do, what they say, how they behave. And when people are in conflict, it's often a pretty negative space. But we need to look below the surface into what's driving that behavior. So it's feelings, interests, identity issues, and needs. Now, interests are the things that people think they're going to get by behaving in the way that they are. Feelings are feelings. It's their emotional response to being in that situation. And much of that is kind of conscious. People are aware of that by and large. But what they may not be aware of is the stuff below that second line there, which is identity and needs. What is it about this particular conflict, especially with a colleague, that is painful for me or triggering for me? And which of those needs that I have are being endangered? If we think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what is this conflict shaking about my sense of self? So when we work as mediators, well, we do two things really. We help people to reflect on their own icebergs, the bits they may not be consciously aware of, and also to step into the shoes of other people that they're in the conflict with, to think, I wonder what's in their iceberg. Because ultimately, conflict resolution is a feelings business. And this is how Harvard puts it, which I think is really nice, that engaging in solving conflict without talking about feelings is like staging an opera without music, in that you'll get the plot, but you'll miss the point. So what does that mean when we see it in a colleague context? Well, we start with a concept called Oshry's total system theory. And Oshry's idea is that when we're in an organization, we will consider ourselves to be somewhere near the top, somewhere in the middle, or somewhere near the bottom. And you can be in multiple systems within an organization. So for example, if you're the head of service, you will perhaps feel like you're towards the top of that system, but you may feel like you're somewhere in the middle when it comes to the trust at large, or somewhere possibly even towards the bottom in the national context. So it kind of depends, depending on the system that you're in. But what doesn't change is what happens when things are going badly or well, depending on where you see yourself in that system. So if things are not going well and you're near the top, you can feel isolated. If you're in the middle, you can feel overloaded. And at the bottom, you feel disempowered. But if things are going well, at the top, you feel connected. In the middle, you feel supportive. And at the bottom, you feel involved with everyone. And what we want to do is try and find a way, if you find yourself in that left-hand space, to move towards that right-hand space. In all of the work that we do in the colleague and team space in healthcare, here's a bit of a bingo card, if you like, of what we see. And I wonder how many of these may resonate with you looking across them. So broadly, there are four main headings of what tends to go wrong. You've got cultural issues, leadership issues, inter and intra-team tensions, and I suppose more general interpersonal issues. So what we see a lot of between colleagues is that people are often battling an institutional legacy. So that's for the whole organization, that things are dealt with in a certain way, and that influences how people behave throughout the whole system. And people tend to accept, after a period of time, behavior as it is within the organization that may or may not be positive. So you get these accepted norms. So to use a kind of throwaway example, the first time a surgeon throws his glove across an operating theatre, it's shocking for everyone. And then that soon becomes just what Mr. X does on a Friday when things aren't going well. Because what happens or can happen is that that behavior is unchecked because of the way that power operates. And it just becomes a, in inverted commas, new normal for that person. And if you look under the leadership column, you see an absence of performance management. Because if you're running a hospital, what you probably don't want to do on a Monday morning is go and tangle with your leading orthopedic surgeon. But that doesn't stop promises being made to people who are experiencing it by and large. So people say, don't worry, we're dealing with it, and things don't get dealt with sometimes. And all of this can lead up to a feeling of a fear of conflict and an unease around challenging each other, and a sense of things being promised but not being kept, which is demoralizing for people. So that's something that we see play out fairly often. In terms of the inter and intra-team tensions between people, hierarchy plays a big role. Hierarchy has its positive attributes. It's clarity, it's situationally helpful for people. but it's also a place where power can operate, and it can be used in a negative way to stop people contributing. A lack of clarity over roles and responsibilities is something that we also see quite a lot. It's seems fairly anemic, but it is what causes quite a lot of conflict between people when they're not quite sure who's doing what and whether people are pulling their weight or not, or stepping on each other's toes. Then you get kind of, the medical, managerial, nursing friction, people being pulled between two places, and a sense of territorial skirmishes. This is my specialty, not yours, tribalism, etc. And then when you get to that fourth column, more into personal questions, you get slights, and importantly, perceived slights. If someone walks past your desk and doesn't say good morning, what explanation do you attribute to that? Do you think, oh, that person's not having a good morning, or do you think that they're alienating me? And so your narrative around what people's behavior can influence how you behave towards them. That's very much that Harvard 4 boxes of what you see and what you don't. Hippos there, it's highest paid person's opinion. That often is where power in a group operates. And hippos can dominate the center ground by being the first and loudest, first to speak, loudest generally, and they can set the narrative, which is unhelpful in team dynamics perspective. Then you get micromanagement and personality clashes, which are pretty common to most teams. So how do we see this playing out within teams at work? In the early stages, you just see things happening again and again in the same way without any real resolution. So there's a kind of a series of wrestling matches that goes on. People start to take sides and speculate about people's behavior and project into what they don't see, what they fear might be there. You get a sense of hopelessness starting, that people think, is this really how we're going to do this? And people start to think tactically, and you get that the beginnings of trust beginning to erode. As things escalate, it becomes about winning. There's a general buildup of resistance in the system. And this sounds quite dramatic, loss of common humanity, but that is what you see, that people start seeing each other less like people and more like objects or obstacles. People start to notice, people start to avoid things, start to avoid meetings, each other, going to work entirely sometimes. And then you get this spread, a bit like if you imagine a glass of water and someone's dripping blue ink into the water. There's a general build-up of cynicism, negativity, and avoidance that occurs. And what happens when you get to the severe end is that it becomes toxic. People are targeted as individuals. Everyone loses here, and point scoring becomes more important than patient care. And one of the things that we often hear is we don't speak to each other, but that has no impact on patient safety. The evidence would indicate otherwise. And then what you get at the kind of really serious end is this kind of carousel of complaints, grievances, and referrals. That is not a place you want to be. So, what do you do about it? You're going to have conflicts in your work. That is inevitable. But what you do with it is where you can have a bit of impact. So the last bit we're going to look at here is, how do we build those different relationships with the penguins? So the big question I think that this raises is conflict with your colleagues something that you want? And it's a question that we pose in the webinar. And it normally splits people. Some people saying, no, conflict is destructive. Some people saying, yes, if it's the right kind of conflict. And some people saying kind of somewhere in the middle. But the answer to this really, and this is based upon Patrick Lencioni, who is an author from the States who's done a lot of work in team dynamics, is that disagreement between colleagues isn't just a nice to have, it's an absolutely essential part of being able to work together as a group. And that means either in a team or with your colleagues outside of your team, because you need to be able to talk about hard things. But in order to be able to talk about hard things, that's level 2, you need to have that base of level 1, which is that sense of trust between each other, inclusion, and a sense of psychological safety. Now, the reason that you need disagreement at that second level is that in healthcare in particular, you need to be able to have unvarnished, unfiltered debate around issues that are important. And if for whatever reason you can't do that, you're avoiding things, the things that you're avoiding are likely to be the important things, because they're the things that are hard to talk about that you're not talking about. And these things do get talked about. They just get talked about in the hall or in the kitchen or on a WhatsApp chat. And the reason that that's particularly important, that you need to be able to talk about these things in the round with everyone there, is that teams who avoid these difficult conversations bury things. So if you're going to focus on one thing in your relationships with your colleagues, it's about a sense of collegiate psychological safety. So Amy Edmondson, again, is from Harvard, defined this idea of psychological safety as an interpersonal climate where people feel able to express ideas, ask questions, acknowledge mistakes, and raise concerns. And she said, from her perspective, psychological safety was the single most important thing to have in a team when compared to everything else. That's what you need to get to, is that sense of psychological safety. And you probably know if you've got it, and you'll almost certainly know if you don't. But that is what you need to try and create. So how do you do that? There are 3 steps, really. It's all about trust, and about supportive team dynamics, and about having those difficult conversations. We're going to touch on those 3 things just before we end. So trust, this is from Brené Brown. She said that trust is the stacking of and layering of small moments and reciprocal vulnerability over time. Trust and vulnerability grow together. If you betray one, you destroy them both. But that the research on it is clear that trust is built in those small moments. And Brené Brown, you might know, she's quite famous now, but she was a nursing scholar when she did her research in trust. And the key thing, I think, to take away from Brené Brown is that trust is a word that's made real by action. So it's not what you think, it's about what you do. And she has this nice example from her TED talk of her daughter's elementary school class in the States, where the teacher keeps a marble jar on the front desk. And whenever one of the kids does something that causes another of them to feel involved or brightens their day, they put a marble in the marble jar. And when they do something which does the opposite, they take a marble out of the marble jar. So it's this idea that in a group, you can see the rising and falling of trust in the marbles in the jar, but it's all about how people are treated, and it's all about behavior. So here's a list of what you as an individual and you as a group can focus on to really build that sense of trust between you. And the first one is right from the behavior side of things. So it's credibility. Can other people tell by my behavior that I have their best interests at heart? So it's not what you feel, it's not what you think, it's about what you do. And linked to that are the next 2, which are really important in trust, which are reliability. Do I say what I'm going to do? And consistency. When people deal with me, do they know what you're going to get? And the research on trust has indicated that those 2 things are the most important things to do, to exhibit at work. The 4th is vault, which is a bit different. This is from Brené Brown. How well do you hold information or experiences that aren't yours to share? The next 2 are from Stephen Covey, and they're linked, I think. Integrity and courage. Are you clear about your individual values? And are your team clear about the team's values? Are you courageous individually and collectively in standing up for them? Are you choosing what's right over what's easy? And particularly important if you're in a leadership position, cohesion. Does your team feel like we're on this journey together? And when we talk about team, I think it's an interesting one, because you may feel, if you are a lead consultant, or my team is my consultant colleagues, or me and the nurses. And I think it's worth having a moment to think about, who do I think of as my team here? Often people get forgotten about. And one of the things that I look for when I work with a clinical team is how well the senior people in that team treat and listen to those people who have minority voices, the most junior, the minority, the forgotten voices, those who are quietest. It's normally quite telling. So that's from Brené Brown and Stephen Covey. So the next two things are building supportive team dynamics. So what you need to do, and this applies if you're a team leader or if you are a member of a team, is make sure that everyone in the group is listened to without being interrupted. And do what you can to make sure that the same voices don't dominate. If you think you might be one of those voices, make room. If you don't talk that much, take the opportunity to speak up when it's provided. Focus on those quieter voices and make sure they feel included and heard. Hold back if you talk too much, as I said. Speak more if you don't talk very much. And also know that speaking and listening are difficult skills, and they need to be done constructively and respectfully. Finally, how to discuss those difficult issues constructively. And one of the rules that I often discuss with teams is having a mutual expectation, so holding each other's feet to the fire, that you are going to talk about the difficult stuff, but you're going to do it in a way that does not focus on individuals. That's all about the collective, not the individual. Encourage people to raise concerns in that psychologically safe space, and encourage questions from everyone, including the most junior people, and share all information that you need to as widely as you can. One of the things that people find useful is the idea of gradients of agreement, that if you have a gradient from 1 to 6, ask people where they are, from 1 being I totally agree to 6 being I really firmly disagree, and asking people where they are. It's much easier to do that than to ask people where they are on something which is divisive. I think finally there's this idea of contribution, which I'd like to finish on. This is from, again, Harvard. This is a very Harvard-sponsored webinar. But the idea here is that when we find ourselves in a conflict with another person, it can feel like a wrestling match, and it can feel exhausting, and that the only person who's going to win is the one that overpowers the other. And what we tend to do is wrap up our arguments in increasingly attractive wrapping paper for people, and then surprised when they don't take them. Harvard suggests something different. They say, think about conflict not so much as a wrestling match, but like you're standing with the person that you're in conflict with in an art gallery. And the problem that you have is a sculpture in front of you. And your job with that other person is to walk around that sculpture and think, which bits have I built? Which bits have you built? What do you think? What are we going to do with this? It seems to have been built between us, so what shall we do now? And what that does is a simple metaphor, a simple psychological step, but it gets you out of a kind of battling frame of mind to thinking, this has arisen, there's no blame here. What are we going to do with it together? Because one of the things that we see in conflict is that when people are in conflict, they don't want to be there. So that is a short starter for 10 on relationships with colleagues and the impact on their team. There are some upcoming bits of training which may be a little outdated now. We've got a mediation training program that we have running at the moment. We have our next webinar on the 24th of May. And we've got a training session run by Sarah and myself on the 15th of June about how to have to manage challenging conversations between parents and health professionals, and that's on the 15th of June. If you're interested in the work that we do this kind of training on building better relationships with colleagues to clinical groups, and we work directly with teams and do clinical team facilitation. We also do training in conflict with parents and families, and we do mediation either between parents and patients and their healthcare teams, or between colleagues. We've also about to launch our new e-learning provision through the Medical Mediation Academy, which is very exciting. More info on that in due course. Well, thank you very much for attending this webinar. I hope there's some interesting things there for you. If you'd like to reach out, I'll go back to that slide there. My email is oscar.mathew@medicalmediation.org.uk, or there's the admin email address there, which is Claire, that you can reach out to as well. But thank you very much and have a lovely day. Bye.